This week, we will be going over some of the essential concepts that underpin the periodization of training and describe the 4 periods of the traditional periodization model. Also, we'll be looking at the 4 sport seasons to the 4 periods of the traditional periodization model, along with describing different periodization periods and other strategies. One of the primary concepts associated with the development and integration of training is periodization. So periodization is widely accepted as a fundamental component of the training process. Individuals may not pay attention or consider how resistance training programs are affected by or integrated with other training factors such as aerobic endurance, speed and agility, plyometric training, and technical and tactical training. So we can define periodization as a theoretical and practical construct that allows for the systematic, sequential, and integrative programming of training interventions into mutually dependent periods of time in order to induce specific physiological adaptations that underpin performance outcomes. There are several distinct goals that periodization training targets, such as 1. Optimizing an athlete's performance at predetermined points or maintaining performance capacity for sports with a specific season. Secondly, another distinct goal is structuring precise training interventions to target the development of specific physiological and performance outcomes. Third, help manage the training stressors to reduce the potential for overtraining. And lastly, promote the athlete's long-term development. So it is essential that the training variation applied through periodization is logical and in a systematic fashion to modulate the training response while decreasing fatigue and elevating the athlete's performance. The general adaptation syndrome is one of the foundational theories from which the concept of periodization of training was developed. It consists of 3 different stages in response to stress. These stages are the alarm phase, the resistance phase, and the exhaustion phase. In this figure, you can see how the different stages of the general adaptation syndrome respond. You can see that there are some other phases which relate to performance, such as the supercompensation phase, which we'll discuss a bit later in this lecture, and also the overtraining phase. So the overtraining phase is where we want to avoid, as this can last several months depending on the severity and how the athlete recovers. The general adaptation syndrome was introduced by Hans Slay, where it was later adapted for exercise programming by Garhammer and Will. Later in 1961, Forbes Carlyle proposed the acceptance of this type of adaptation as a guide for coaching. So let's take a look at how the general adaptation syndrome is applied to a high school 100-meter sprint athlete. So the alarm phase is in response to exercise, where we'll see then a decrease in performance within the first few days, and this can last up to a week. This is where the athlete will have excessive soreness, stiffness, such as DOMS, and their energy stores will be lower, all which will cause that decrease in performance. The second phase, or the resistance phase, is where the body resists to the exercise stress and performance will either return back to baseline or increase. It should be noted, though, that the neural adaptations predominate in response to resistance training at the very beginning. However, it does not mean that muscle hypertrophy is not occurring. So when we look at muscle hypertrophy, the pace of it is just a lot slower initially. The exhaustion phase, which is the last phase, is where the athlete loses the ability to adapt to the stressor and will have similar symptoms experienced during the alarm phase, such as soreness and fatigue. The cause of the exhaustion phase may be too much training volume or intensity, or too little recovery between training sessions. So some things that may be playing as well in the role for this exhaustion phase could be improper diet, psychological burnout and staleness of the program. So generally speaking, we want to avoid this phase because if it continues, it will lead to overtraining, which is very detrimental to the athlete. This stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation theory is an extension of the general adaptation syndrome and suggests that training stimuli produce a general response that is influenced by the overall magnitude of the training stressor. So the greater the overall magnitude of the workload, the more fatigue accumulates, and then the longer the delay before complete recovery and adaptation can actually occur. So when the athlete recovers from and adapts to the training stimulus, fatigue will then dissipate and then the preparedness and performance will increase. Here's the figure demonstrating the stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation theory. So this is the basic pattern that is presented whenever an athlete is exposed to a training exercise, a training session, a training day, or even a cycle within the periodized training program. In order to effectively develop periodized training plans, it is important to realize the general pattern of response to a training stimulus, which again can result from a single exercise, a training session, or day, or even a cycle. It should be noted that during the recovery process, the athlete may not completely recover before a new training session. So during this time, alternating heavy and light days may help facilitate recovery. Also, if no new training stimulus is encountered after recovery period and adaptations are completed, then preparedness and performance will start to decline, which is referred to as a state of involution. One sequential model that is largely based on the stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation theory is the concentrated loading or conjugated sequencing model. A concentrated training load or accumulation load is applied for a specific time period. So after this accumulation load, there is a significant reduction in the training load and training is returned back to normal levels. So this is referred to as the transmutation phase, where the athlete will have an increase in preparedness and performance. The final phase of this loading paradigm involves a further reduction in training load and is referred to as a peak, taper, or realization phase. You will typically see a supercompensation response to the further reduction in fatigue. However, if this phase is extended for more than 14 days, preparedness or performance will start to decline. Here we can see how the concentrated loading sequencing model relates to the stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation theory. This may help direct the training responses toward the targeted outcome for the athlete's goal. The fitness fatigue paradigm partially explains the relationships among fitness, fatigue, and preparedness. Every training bout, session, or cycle creates both fatigue and fitness after effects, which summate to create a state of preparedness. So training at high loads results in both increased fitness level, but also an increase in fatigue. When training at low loads, there is little fatigue occurring and minimal fitness occurring as well. So fatigue dissipates at a faster rate than fitness, which allows preparedness to increase if appropriate training strategies are utilized. So therefore, it is crucial when designing training interventions that the actual sequential pattern be considered in the context of how the training intervention is structured. There are several interrelated periods that need to be considered when creating a training plan. A macrocycle is a period that can last an entire year of training or months depending on the sport. Within each macrocycle are mesocycles, which last several weeks to months. Mesocycles can be broken down into microcycles that last from several days to weeks, in which 4 weeks is most common. We can further break down the training periods of the microcycle to training days and then into training sessions. Here is an example of the breakdown of a 1-year training plan where it's broken down into mesocycles and then microcycles, and when we further break down that microcycle into the training day. An annual training plan is also sometimes called a macrocycle. So that is why a macrocycle can last an entire year of training for an athlete depending on the sport. If the athlete has multiple seasons within a year or is a multiple sport athlete, you may need to incorporate more macrocycles. So looking at the overall training plan, the basic loading progression is from higher volumes of training towards a higher intensity with lower volume training, which is more technique oriented. The training load will also change throughout the year and training focus will be altered. In outlining a periodization plan, the starting point is usually the preparatory period. So this period is usually the longest and occurs during the time of the year where there are no competitions and technical, tactical, or sport-specific work is limited. This period is often referred to as the off-season, and the goal of this period is to develop a base level of conditioning in order to increase the athlete's ability to tolerate more intense training. This is where you would provide high volume but at a low intensity. The preparatory period can also be subdivided into general and specific phases. Additionally, this period can serve as a time to test athletes to help determine the training loads for a new mesocycle. And typically, you will want to test the athletes during the first week of the off-season. In the preparatory period, the resistance training phases can be created in order to depict more refined differences in training intensity and volume. The first one is the hypertrophy strength endurance phase. So this typically occurs during the early portion of the preparatory period, such as during the general preparatory phase. The training intensity is low to moderate and the overall volume is high. The second one is the basic strength phase, which occurs during the specific preparatory phase. During this time, the training intensity is high and the volume is moderate to high volume. Also, this is where the training becomes more sport specific. Next is the first transition period, which is a link between the preparatory and competitive periods. So a central aim of this period is the development of increased strength in the power development. The training intensity is low to very high with low volumes. Also during this time, this is where we have an increase in plyometric drills and power or explosive exercises such as the hang clean, power clean, or snatch. We can also see that there will be an increase in sport practices as well due to it being the preseason. The goal of the competition period is still maintaining power output and strength that was accumulated from the off-season programming. In some cases, you might be able to increase the power output and strength during this time. Also, depending on the sport, the athlete is in their competition, which may be as short as 1 week long or many months. So during this time, you'll want to reduce the resistance training volume, but increase the intensity. So we can reduce the training volume by the frequency, so how many times a week that they are actually training. Since this is the competitive period, majority of the athlete's time will be spent on skill and strategy development. There are two options in training which you can focus on depending on the length of the season. The peaking strategy attempts to place the athlete in peak condition about 1 to 2 weeks. During this peaking strategy, athletes will use a very high intensity and progress to a lower intensity work and very low volumes to help reduce fatigue. So if you have an athlete who is more kind of team oriented, such as a basketball player, football or softball player, a maintenance program should be implemented since the season kind of spans over months. So athletes will use moderate to high intensity with moderate volumes during this maintenance phase. A thing to note is that you can still incorporate a peaking strategy with these athletes during the last week or two prior to competition. However, though, this will depend on the sport and how the competitive games are spaced out. The second transition provides a period of time in which athletes can rehabilitate injuries and refresh both physically and mentally before beginning a new annual training program. Also, this is the linkage between the competitive season and the preparatory period. This period is sometimes referred to as an active rest or restoration period. This time period usually is considered the postseason, where there are unstructured, non-sport specific activities. This figure here provides an overall view of the different periods along with the recommended intensity and volume for those periods. It is important that periodized training programs be sequenced and integrated. There are still strength and conditioning professionals that still have difficulties in this area. This can be seen in programs where many or all training factors are addressed or emphasized at one time. By doing so, this generates high levels of fatigue and makes it virtually impossible to optimize performance at the appropriate times. Further, this can increase the risk of overtraining and injury for the athlete. By having a periodized training plan, this minimizes both of those risks. So overall, a sequential training approach can be crafted in which complementary training factors are emphasized at specific time points. This table here provides the primary training emphasis along with the compatible training factors. This may help depending on the athlete's goal and may help you when programming. There are infinite sequencing possibilities that can be employed when constructing a training plan. The commonly used methods are the traditional or classic model, the summated microcycle model, and the conjugated sequencing model. The traditional or classical model is referred to as linear periodization, where this type of model gradually increases in exercise intensity, where initially it starts with low intensity but high volume and transitions by the end with a high intensity but low volume. A central component of the traditional model is a complex system that employs the parallel development of physical abilities. So because of this, this may not optimize the physiological and performance adaptations of intermediate and advanced athletes, and this is best suited for novice or beginner athletes. One reason why linear periodization may not be advantageous for advanced athletes is that they already have a high level of special physical preparedness. They require a significant training stimulus that targets a very finite emphasis to induce some sort of adaptation. So with linear periodization, this produces a very small window of time where a novel stimulus is available. However, with novice athletes, linear periodization allows for stabilization of technical skills and other training factors. A second reason why linear periodization may not be advantageous is that it cannot produce the high specific physical preparedness that advanced athletes need. So this model generates an overall balance for the athlete but does not optimize any specific training factor, which may result mute training adaptations and a smaller increase in performance gain. The classic model relies on long periods of basic and sport-specific preparation, which may be beneficial for novice athletes, but may be considered a disadvantage for the advanced athletes just because of the insufficient training variation. A fourth reason is that the elite competition requires a high level of technical competency. So developing technical competencies while simultaneously establishing special physical preparedness accumulates a large amount of fatigue, which can lead to a decrease in technical skills. And the last reason is that the modern athletic calendar often contains many competitions that the classic periodization model cannot address. So again, the classic model of periodization is best suited for novice or beginning athletes. The summated microcycle model increases training variation with an integrated sequence training structure. So this model is often utilized with intermediate to advanced athletes. Moreover, this model introduces complementary training factors in a cyclical pattern that allows for a lower rate and magnitude of residual decay or involution. A typical structure for a summated microcycle is based on a 4-week block of training that progresses from an extensive to an intensive workload, followed by a brief restitution period. This summated microcycle model emphasizes a very specific training factor, while other complementary training factors receive a minimal emphasis. So therefore, the training focus is better sequenced and integrated across the various training protocols. The structure of this utilizes 4 interlinked microcycles that ultimately comprise of a mesocycle block. The load structure progresses from an extensive to intensive workloads across 3 successive microcycles, followed by a recovery microcycle. The general loading structure is referred to as a 3-to-1 loading paradigm. The first 3 weeks increase in training volume, intensity, training density, or some sort of combination of the factors, which is followed by a recovery or unloaded week. By the end of the 3rd microcycle, the highest levels of fatigue are developed and performance capacity can significantly be impaired. This is where the recovery period is very vital because it reduces fatigue and potential for overtraining. Also, this is going to elevate preparedness and facilitate the physiological adaptations needed for the next training block. A second method of loading that is often used in conjunction with the summated microcycle model employs a concentrated loading or planned overreaching period. A planned overreaching is a systematic attempt to overstress the body for a short period of training where the training volume is high and is then returned back to normal. So during the high training volume, the athlete will experience a decrease in performance and an increase in fatigue. Once training volume is back to normal, full recovery can take days to weeks, all depending on the athlete. However, if done appropriately, a supercompensation effect will occur. And this supercompensation effect is an increase in performance above that baseline level. This figure shows the outline of a planned overreaching protocol where there will be that decreased performance, but following recovery, an increase in performance. So a lot of powerlifters will utilize this strategy, so when it comes to the powerlifting meet, they are performing at their highest level. The effectiveness of a summated microcycle model can be enhanced by employing intra-microcycle variation tactics. So this allows for different intensities to be utilized on different training days. The term associated with this is daily undulating periodization. With this, you can have an athlete training at different repetition schemes to help target a specific adaptation or training goal. So for example, if a goal of your athlete is to increase strength, then a couple days of training would focus on the strength intensity and repetitions, while another day is set more for the hypertrophy endurance repetition scheme. The conjugated sequencing model is generally employed with advanced athletes. So central to this model is the sequencing of accumulation, transmutation, and realization or recovery mesocycles. Central to the effectiveness of the conjugated sequencing model is the accumulation loading block. So this block typically lasts between 2 and 4 weeks. The performance and preparedness is decreased in response to an elevated level of accumulated fatigue. So conceptually, this block saturates the system with one major training emphasis. As training shifts into the transmutation block, the emphasis changes, and then the workloads are then redistributed. So the last block, the realization block, lasts about 1 to 2 weeks. And then during this, realization block, fatigue is dissipated and a significant increase in preparedness and then performance for the athlete occurs. When constructing a training plan, several blocks of accumulation, transmutation, and realization can be linked together in order to direct training toward a specific physiological and performance outcome. An appropriate plan will increase the athlete's level of preparedness and performance across the sequentially linked blocks, and also the performance will be supercompensated at the appropriate time points. So when compared to linear periodization or the classical model, this has the potential to produce superior gains. One interesting thing is that this model is useful when targeting the development of power and speed compared to heavy resistance training. Here's a table that provides some basic steps when planning a training program for an athlete. So you can see here there's about 7 different steps, and within each 7 steps they have sub-steps or kind of subdivisions with some sort of objective. So kind of just utilize this whenever you are creating your program for your athlete, and this should ultimately optimize their training and their performance outcomes. So in summary, periodization of training is an essential component of the athlete's long-term development. It should be considered a logical, integrative, and sequential manipulation of training factors in order to optimize training outcomes at predetermined time points. Also, periodization is a theoretical and practical paradigm that is well established as a superior method of helping develop athletes, especially over the long term. Also, we can look at periodization as a planning process that allows the strength and conditioning professional to structure training that targets specific physiological and performance outcomes while managing the training and life stressors that the athlete is exposed to, such as college life, such as tests and so forth and competitions. We can also think of these training periods that should be considered and structured when designing an athlete's program, which include the annual training plan, the macro cycle, the mesocycle, the microcycle, and then the training day and training session. Lastly, although the classical model of periodization is helpful for novice or beginning athletes, these advanced athletes that you will most likely be working with require sequential models of periodization that are a little bit more complex. So these include the summated microcycle model and the conjugated sequencing model.